In the year 1898, a photograph was taken on a busy street in the heart of a thriving American city. The image showed nothing unusual at first glance. People walked along the sidewalks. Carriages moved through the streets. Buildings stood tall and proud. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like any other day in that era. But when someone looked closer, when they zoomed in on one specific detail, they discovered something that should not have been possible. A large clock mounted on the front of a bank was moving backward. This discovery began in a quiet archive room many years later. Fabian worked as an archivist for the city. His job was to catalog old photographs and documents. He spent his days scanning images and writing descriptions. Most days were routine. Most photographs showed exactly what you would expect from 1898. But one afternoon, Fabian loaded a high-resolution scan of a street scene onto his computer screen. The photo came from the city archive collection. It showed a view of the main commercial district. In the background stood a large building with columns and ornate stonework. This was the Central Bank Building, one of the most important financial institutions in the city at that time. Fabian began his usual process. He noted the date stamped on the back of the original print. He wrote down the location. He started to describe what he saw in the image. Then he zoomed in to check for any damage or deterioration that might need special attention during preservation. That was when he noticed the clock. The Central Bank Building had a massive external clock mounted above its main entrance. The clock face showed Roman numerals. The hands were clearly visible in the photograph. Fabian looked at the position of the hands. Then he looked at the shadows in the street. Then he looked at the density of foot traffic and the position of the sun. Something was wrong. The shadows suggested it was around midday. The street activity matched what you would expect for the middle of a business day, but the clock hands showed a time that did not match. More than that, the way the hands were positioned suggested they were moving in the opposite direction from normal. Fabian leaned closer to his screen. He adjusted the contrast. He zoomed in further. The detail was clear. This was not a printing error. This was not a trick of light. The clock appeared to be running backward. Fabian knew he needed help understanding what he was seeing. He contacted Tanner, a historian who specialized in unusual temporal records and mechanical systems from the late 19th century. Tanner had spent decades studying how people in the past measured and displayed time. He had written papers about clock mechanisms and timekeeping traditions. When Fabian showed him the photograph, Tanner immediately understood that this was not a simple malfunction. Tanner examined the image for hours. He measured the angles of the clock hands. He compared them to standard mechanical configurations. He consulted technical diagrams of clock movements from that period. His conclusion was clear. The hands were oriented in a way that suggested deliberate movement opposite to standard mechanics. This was not a broken clock that had stopped or moved randomly. This was a clock that appeared to be functioning perfectly, but displaying time in reverse. The first theory was obvious. Perhaps the clock had simply malfunctioned. Perhaps a gear had broken or a spring had come loose. But Tanner dismissed this theory quickly. He explained that when mechanical clocks fail, they stop or move erratically. They do not run smoothly in the opposite direction. The precision required to make a clock run backward while maintaining accurate movement would actually be more complex than making it run forward. Someone would have to design it that way on purpose. This realization led Tanner to begin a deeper investigation. He needed to find records about the Central Bank Building clock. He needed to understand its history and maintenance. He traveled to the city archives and began searching through boxes of old documents. He looked for construction records. He looked for maintenance logs. He looked for any mention of the clock or any problems with it. After weeks of searching, Tanner found the maintenance log for the Central Bank Building from 1898. The log was a leather-bound book with entries written in careful handwriting. Each entry documented routine inspections and minor repairs. Tanner found entries from the weeks immediately before and immediately after the photograph was taken. The entries showed that inspections had been performed. Everything was recorded as functioning normally. There was no mention of any clock trouble. The log was signed by Marcello, who held the position of chief mechanist for the building. This discovery created the first real controversy. How could a clock be photographed running backward during a period when maintenance records showed it was functioning perfectly? Tanner knew he was missing something important. He expanded his search beyond the building's internal records. He began looking through old newspapers from 1898. He wanted to see if anyone had noticed or commented on anything unusual about the clock. In a collection of newspapers from that year, Tanner found something remarkable. 2 days after the photograph was taken, a short article appeared in the Metropolitan Daily Record. The article was written by Rowan, a local journalist who covered business and municipal affairs. The article mentioned the central bank building clock in passing. Rowan wrote that some observers had reported seeing the bank clock appear to run backward on certain days. The article noted that bank officials had dismissed these reports as visual distortions caused by humidity and atmospheric conditions. The article was brief and treated the matter as a curiosity rather than a serious concern. But this newspaper clipping confirmed something crucial. The backward movement of the clock had been noticed at the time. It had been discussed publicly, and it had been dismissed by the bank. Tanner now knew that this was not just an artifact of the photograph. The clock had actually displayed this behavior in a way that living people could observe and comment on. Tanner continued searching through archives and collections. He found personal papers donated by families who had lived in the city during that era. In one collection, he discovered a diary that had belonged to Isaias, a bank teller who had worked at the Central Bank building in 1898. The diary entries were mostly routine notes about daily life. But several entries mentioned the clock. Isaias wrote about feeling uneasy when looking at it. He described a sensation of temporal drift when he glanced up at the clock during his workday. He wrote that other employees felt the same way, but nobody discussed it openly. They simply avoided looking at the clock too carefully. These personal accounts added a psychological dimension to the mystery. The clock was not just mechanically anomalous. It created an emotional response in people who saw it regularly. This suggested that whatever was happening was noticeable enough and consistent enough to affect people's daily experience. Fabian and Tanner now had several pieces of evidence. They had the photograph showing the backward movement. They had maintenance records showing the clock was supposedly functioning normally. They had newspaper accounts confirming that observers had seen the backward movement. They had personal diary entries describing the unsettling effect the clock had on people. But they still did not understand why this was happening or what it meant. Tanner decided to investigate Marcello, the chief mechanist whose signature appeared in the maintenance logs. He searched for information about Marcello's background and training. What he discovered opened up an entirely new dimension to the mystery. Marcello had a reputation in certain technical circles for holding unconventional views about timekeeping. He had written articles for engineering journals arguing that clock mechanisms should reflect an observer's perception of time rather than just its objective measurement. He believed that time was experienced differently depending on context, and that mechanical devices could be designed to express this variability. These were radical ideas for the period. Most engineers and clockmakers believed their job was to create mechanisms that kept time as accurately and consistently as possible. But Marcello saw timekeeping as something more complex. He believed clocks could be tools for communication and meaning beyond simple hour tracking. This philosophical approach suggested that if anyone would design a clock that could run backward, it would be Marcello. Tanner needed to find more direct evidence linking Marcello to the central bank building clock. He returned to the construction archives and requested access to original building plans and specifications. Most of these documents were straightforward architectural drawings and contractor agreements, But Tanner noticed that some page numbers were missing from the bound volumes. There were gaps in the sequence. This suggested that some documents had been removed or filed separately. Tanner asked the archive staff if there were any sealed or restricted annexes to the central bank building records. After checking their catalog system, the staff located a small metal box that had been stored separately. The box was locked and labeled with a notation indicating it contained supplementary technical specifications. It took 2 days to locate the key and get permission to open it. Inside the box, Tanner found what he had been searching for. There was a set of heavily detailed technical drawings for the central bank building clock mechanism. The drawings were signed by Marcello. They showed not just a standard clock movement but a complex system of gears and levers that could be activated to reverse the direction of the hands without stopping the mechanism or damaging it. The drawings included annotations in Marcello's handwriting explaining the purpose of this reversal gear system. He described it as a signal apparatus for discrete temporal communication. This discovery changed everything. The clock had been deliberately designed with the ability to run backward. It was not a malfunction or an accident. It was a built-in feature. But why would a bank want a clock that could run backward? What purpose could this possibly serve? Tanner showed the technical drawings to Fabian. Together, they tried to understand the reasoning behind such an unusual design. They looked at the annotations more carefully. They noticed references to economic instability protocols and investor signal systems. These phrases suggested that the backward movement of the clock was connected to financial operations rather than just timekeeping. To understand this connection, they needed to know more about the financial history of 1898. Fabian reached out to Zane, an economic historian who specialized in banking practices during the late 19th century. Zane was familiar with the various formal and informal communication methods that banks used during that era. Banks operated in a much less regulated environment than they do today. They often developed private systems for communicating with their most important clients and investors. Zane reviewed the technical drawings and the historical context. He explained that during the 1890s, financial institutions were dealing with periodic crises and instability. Bank runs could happen suddenly. Investor confidence could collapse overnight. Major institutions needed ways to communicate sensitive information to their inner circle without causing public panic. They needed signals that would be visible, but not obvious. They needed codes that only certain people would understand. Zane suggested looking at what was happening in the banking sector in 1898 specifically. Were there any financial problems during the period when the photograph was taken? Fabian and Tanner returned to the archives and began searching through economic records and financial newspapers from that year. They found that in the spring and summer of 1898, there was a minor but significant banking sector crisis. Several institutions faced liquidity problems. There were concerns about loan defaults and investment losses. The crisis was not as severe as some earlier panics, but it was serious enough that banks needed to take protective measures. The central bank building was one of the institutions affected by these problems. This timing was crucial. The photograph was taken during this crisis period. The backward movement of the clock was documented during the same window of time. This could not be coincidence. Tanner and Fabian now believed they understood the purpose of the reversal gear system. The clock was designed to send a signal during times of economic instability, but what exactly was the signal meant to communicate? To answer this question, they needed to find more information about the bank's internal operations and decision-making processes. Fabian searched for correspondence between bank officials and major investors. He found letters in several different archive collections. Some letters had been donated by wealthy families. Others had been preserved as part of legal records. In this correspondence, Fabian found references to a temporal indicator and a reversal protocol. The letters did not explain these terms directly, but they were mentioned in the context of financial strategy meetings and investment decisions. One letter from Nasir, a major investor in the bank, mentioned receiving confirmation of the reversal signal and approving a specific investment action in response. Fabian showed these letters to Zane. The economic historian immediately recognized what they meant. The backward movement of the clock was a prearranged signal to the bank's most important investors. It indicated that the bank's leadership was activating a specific financial plan designed to reverse or counteract negative trends. The signal told investors that protective measures were being implemented. It told them that the bank was taking action according to a previously agreed strategy. This system was ingenious in its subtlety. The clock was a public fixture. Anyone could see it, but only people who knew about the signal system would understand what the backward movement meant. To everyone else, it would just look like a malfunctioning clock or perhaps an optical illusion. The bank could even publicly dismiss reports of the backward movement as errors or tricks of light, as they did in the newspaper article. Meanwhile, the investors who mattered would see the signal and know exactly what it meant. Tanner wanted to confirm this interpretation. He looked for any documents that explicitly described the signal system and its purpose. In Marcello's personal papers, which had been donated to a technical library after his death, Tanner found a partial journal. The journal contained notes about various clock projects and engineering challenges. One entry described the central bank building clock project. Marcello wrote that he had been commissioned to design a timepiece that could communicate financial intentions through mechanical reversal. He wrote that the bank's founders wanted a non-verbal signal visible to those who knew to watch for it. The journal entry confirmed everything. The clock was designed as a secret communication device. The reversal gear system was meant to be activated during specific circumstances related to economic instability. When the clock ran backward, it told informed observers that the bank was implementing its prearranged crisis response plan. The signal was meant to inspire confidence among key investors while remaining invisible to the general public. With this understanding, Fabian and Tanner could now explain the photograph completely. In 1898, during a period of banking sector crisis, the central bank building activated its reversal signal. The clock ran backward to communicate this activation to investors. Someone took a photograph of the street scene on that particular day. The photograph captured the signal in action. The image preserved this moment of secret communication for more than a century. Nobody looking at the photograph would understand what they were seeing unless they knew the full story behind the clock mechanism. The discovery of this system revealed something important about how powerful institutions operated during that era. In the late 1800s, the United States was in the midst of the Gilded Age. This was a time of tremendous economic growth but also great instability. Banks and corporations wielded enormous influence. Wealthy investors and business leaders often had access to information and opportunities that ordinary citizens did not. Secret codes and private signals were common tools for maintaining advantages and coordinating actions among elite groups. The central bank building clock was a perfect example of this kind of system. It used a public display of time, something everyone could see and presumably understand, to hide a layer of private meaning accessible only to insiders. The complexity required to design and implement such a system showed the lengths to which institutions would go to manage information and control perception. Marcello had created a remarkable piece of engineering that served not just as a timepiece but as a covert communication tool. The personal accounts from people like Isaias, the bank teller who felt unsettled by the clock, add another dimension to this story. Even people who did not know about the signal system could sense that something unusual was happening. The backward movement created a subtle but noticeable disruption in their experience of time and space. This psychological effect suggests that even secret systems leave traces. Even hidden signals have an impact that extends beyond their intended audience. For Fabian and Tanner, solving this mystery meant piecing together evidence from multiple sources. They had to combine archival photographs with maintenance logs, newspaper articles with personal diaries, technical drawings with financial correspondence. Each piece of evidence revealed part of the story. Only by bringing them all together could they understand the full picture. The photograph itself became more than just an image of a street scene. It became a historical document capturing a moment of secret communication. It showed how power operated invisibly in plain sight. It demonstrated how technology could be used for purposes beyond its obvious function. It preserved a signal that was meant to be temporary and visible only to a select few. This story illustrates something important about historical research and how we understand the past. We often assume that old photographs show us exactly what happened. We think we can trust what we see. But images, like all historical sources, contain multiple layers of meaning. They can hide as much as they reveal. Understanding them requires careful investigation, creative thinking, and willingness to question apparent simplicity. The backward clock was visible in the photograph all along. Anyone looking at the image could have seen it. But without context, without knowledge of the signal system, without understanding the financial and engineering history behind it, the backward movement would have seemed like nothing more than a curious malfunction. Only through systematic research could the true significance of this detail emerge. Tanner and Fabian's investigation also highlights the importance of preserving historical records. The maintenance logs, personal diaries, newspaper articles, technical drawings, and correspondence that solved this mystery were all preserved in archives and collections. If any of these documents had been lost or destroyed, the story would have remained incomplete. Archives serve as memory institutions, keeping fragments of the past available for future investigation. The central bank building clock system was eventually replaced in the early 1900s. The building underwent renovations and modernization. The old clock with its reversal gear system was removed and probably scrapped. No physical evidence of the mechanism survives today. Only the documentary record and this one photograph preserve knowledge of its existence and function. This raises questions about how many other secret systems and hidden signals existed in the past. How many other photographs contain details whose significance we do not yet understand? How many documents and artifacts hold meanings that remain invisible to us because we lack the right context or knowledge? History is full of things we have not yet learned to read. The backward clock story also shows how technical innovation can be applied in unexpected ways. Marcello was clearly a skilled engineer. He understood mechanical systems deeply enough to create a clock that could reverse its direction smoothly and reliably. But he used this skill not just to improve timekeeping accuracy, but to create a tool for secret communication. Technology is always shaped by the social and political purposes it serves. The same ingenuity that can solve practical problems can also create systems of hidden control and exclusive access. For modern viewers, this story serves as a reminder to look closely at historical images and to question what we think we see. Details that seem insignificant or inexplicable might contain important information. Anomalies and oddities often point toward deeper stories. Taking time to investigate unusual elements can reveal hidden dimensions of the past. The photograph from 1898 still exists in the city archives. Visitors can view it if they request access. At first glance, it still looks like an ordinary street scene. People walk, carriages move, buildings stand. But now, if you zoom in on the clock mounted on the central bank building, you can see it as Fabian saw it. You can recognize it as Tanner understood it. You can know that this is not just a timepiece, but a signal. You can see a moment when the past communicated in a language most people could not understand. The truth is not always in what we see at first. Sometimes the truth is in what we discover when we look closer. Sometimes the truth is in the reversal, in the thing that runs counter to expectations, in the detail that should not be there but is. The backward clock reminds us that history holds secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice, to question, and to investigate. And when those secrets are finally revealed, they change how we understand not just a single photograph but an entire era, and the complex ways power and communication operated within it.